Good evening, Radulich and broadcasting faithful. It is I, your mandated reporter, and frankly I'm mortified, Mr. Mark Radulich, and tonight we are continuing our look at the history of the lineal heavyweight championship of the world in boxing. This is Chapter 7, the World Boxing Association Heavyweight Tournament, held 1967 through 1968. This tournament was put together after Muhammad Ali refused to enter the military and was subsequently punished by stripping him of his license and his titles. Joining me on this journey, as he has for the past 6 chapters, is the one and only punchy pugilist, Pat Mullin. How do you do, sir?
Mark, I've had a day, I've had a week, I've had a month, and I've even had a year. All today.
You know, at least we got live UFC this past weekend, right?
We did, and it was much needed.
And then we got the Roadrunner and Coyote Wrestling Federation Money in the Bank match.
Yeah, that wasn't as needed.
All right. So, Pat, I kind of just gave the headline there, but tell me a little bit about the preparations for this tournament, going back to why the WBA decided to, I guess the short answer is they stripped him of the title because he couldn't defend it because he had no license. But the members of the tournament were as follows, and we'll go through them one by one individually, but just a short list here. We had Jimmy Ellis, Carl Mildenberger, Oscar Bonavina, Ernie Terrell, Thad Spencer, the aforementioned Floyd Patterson. You can check him out in our earlier chapter of this series. And finally, Velvet Pants himself, Irish Jerry Quarry. So, catch us up to speed here. How did we get to this tournament with these individuals?
So, basically what happened was, as you said, Ali got stripped of the title. What they do is they can't figure out how they're going to crown a new champion. There's a new sanctioning body in play called the WBA, which technically isn't new, but because most championships have been undisputed, it never really factored into things as much. So what they decided to do is the only fair way they think to do it is to match their top 8 heavyweight contenders. There's a problem. Their number 1 heavyweight contender, the guy who probably was conspicuous by his absence and the guys you named, is Smokin' Joe Frazier. Joe decides, I don't really want to fight in this tournament because I'm being offered to fight for another version of the World Heavyweight Championship that's being recognized by the New York State Athletic Commission, the British Boxing Board of Control, and several other bodies that are pretty much on the same plane of existence as the WBA at the time. And instead of fighting in a tournament, he just has to fight one guy, Buster Mathis, who he fought as an amateur and actually lost to, but still made the Olympic team. So instead of going through the WBA politics, as it were, he decides to take one fight instead of 3 to be recognized as a heavyweight champion. And what that did was clear the way for Leotis Martin, who you mentioned, to come into the tournament.
All right, so let's take these one by one. The star of our tournament and its eventual winner is Jimmy Ellis. Jimmy Ellis was born February 24th, 1940, in Louisville, Kentucky. He was 23-5 when he fought Leotis Martin in the opening bracket of this tournament, which took place on August 6th, 1967. We'll talk more about Jimmy Ellis as the show continues. So let's talk about his opponent, who will get his one and only mention now, so put a little bit of time into this. Leotis Martin, born March 10th, 1939, was the first ever NABF heavyweight champion and is best known for his victory over former heavyweight champion, the Devil, Sonny Liston. Sonny Liston was the devil, if you'll remember. Martin was the 1960 Chicago and Intercity Golden Gloves 160-pound champion and the 1961 160-pound Intercity Golden Gloves champion. He was also the U.S. National AEU 165-pound champion in 1960 and 1961. He had amassed a 24-1 record going into his fight with Jimmy Ellis. So let's stop there and talk about these two individuals and how they matched up, Pat.
So what you're going to see is Ellis, who's part of the Angelo Dundee camp out of Louisville, which includes Muhammad Ali, mind you. Ellis is best known as Ali's sparring partner at this point in time, believe it or not, despite a pretty good career as a middleweight and then making the move up to heavyweight with Dundee. Leotis Martin is best known as a former sparring partner of Sonny Liston, despite some good wins and a fine record at last beating Billy Tumbler Daniels to qualify for this tournament, basically, once Frazier opted out. So Martin is more a power hitter. His record doesn't show it because in 31 wins, he only had 19 knockouts, which when heavyweights, you're thinking power hitters, you're thinking George Foreman, Ernie Shavers, maybe 2-3 guys go the distance. But if you watched UFC 249 this past weekend, he's more in the mold of what you saw from Justin Gaethje against Tony Ferguson, in that he really took a measured approach and lined you up for a perfect power shot. And that's really what his game was. Jimmy Ellis, who, not by any coincidence, who he sparred with, and because of his size, Ellis was much more a mover, a dancer, an evasive type fighter who didn't really come at you head on. And based on that matchup, you would think the longer the fight went, the more it would favor Ellis, and as it turns out, it did.
Now, if I recall, and again, I watched these over the course of 2 days, most today, but I believe Martin actually floored Ellis early on in the fight, and then Ellis had a cut over his eye for most of that fight, if I recall, and he would eventually turn it around and just beat down Martin over the course of the next several rounds, finally having the fight stopped via TKO in the 9th.
Yeah, which is what happened. And again, early on, you saw a really good Martin approach where he floored Ellis, like you said, in the second round. He was able to press, but unfortunately for him, Jimmy Ellis, by virtue of who he trained with and how he trained, was very good at riding his punches. And when you do that, you don't take the full impact of the punch, and it takes a lot out of the guy trying to throw these power shots over and over. And, unfortunately for Leotis, he kind of learned that lesson the hard way in this fight, where he started looking for the shell answer about the 6th, 7th round. He started running out of gas. And you really saw Ellis turn on the aggression at that point because he knew that Martin's power shots didn't have the steam on them, which allowed him more opportunities to come out and punch, which he did. And as a result, he got the stoppage.
Which brings us to our next pair of fighters. We have the European Heavyweight Champion from 64 to 68, Carl Mildenberger, who we spoke about in a previous episode. He was born November 23rd, 1937. He was from Germany. And he had retained the title 6 times, amassing a record of 52-3-3. And he was the favorite going into his fight on September 16th, 1967, against Argentinian Oscar Bonavena. He had a career of 58 wins, 9 losses, and 1 draw. He was described as a rugged, wild, swinging puncher and nicknamed Ringo because of his Beatles haircut. He enjoyed both success in Argentina and the United States, and he amassed a record of 30-3 going into this fight. And as I said, Mildenberger was seen as the easy favorite going into this fight, but Bonavena gave Mildenberger the business and ended up winning a unanimous decision.
Funny story behind this one. So, I don't know if you watched the pre-fight stuff to this one that showed with the actual fight, Mark.
Tell the people what they're missing.
If you did, then you saw who was doing the translation and interviews with Oscar Bonavena for the broadcast. That was Angelo Dundee.
That's right. They mentioned him a bunch of times.
Yes. So Angelo, as was mentioned, is part of Jimmy Ellis's camp. He was Jimmy Ellis's manager and was actually with Ellis before he was with Ali, but he functioned as the manager for Ellis along with Chicky Ferraro working to help train him. But basically what happened was, for media coverage for this fight, Angelo was the liaison to Bonavena's camp. As you'll recall, when we talked about the first heavyweight championship reign of Muhammad Ali, Angelo got up close and personal with Mildenberger when Ali defended the title against him. Angelo spends basically most of Bonavena's camp showing him how to fight Mildenberger, saying, hey, he gave my guy a lot of trouble early, but here's what you can do to stop that. And not surprisingly, based on that, early on, Bonavena, even in moments where he's being outboxed, is able to just land these beautiful counter punches that he walks Mildenberger into that drop him repeatedly. Till eventually, Bonavena is able to just assert his will and take over the whole fight. And what this leads to, we'll get to in the semifinals, but just underscore that Dundee spent a lot of time with Bonavena.
Yeah, Bonavena, I watched that fight earlier today, and Mildenberger, I don't know if he was underestimating Bonavena or what, but he was having a rough time in there, and there's a couple of spots throughout that fight where Bonavena sends Mildenberger just flying all over the ring, and he's stumbling, he's dropped him a couple of times, and the commentators for 1967 are like flabbergasted that Bonavena's doing so well.
Well, because he's such a crude style of fighter, and really the one fight of note that Bonavena's had in the States to this point is he fought Joe Frazier a year prior and had Frazier on the deck twice in a fight where if he would have knocked him down one more time in that round, he would have automatically won based on the 3 knockdown rule. He didn't. Frazier held on to win a tight decision, but it was thought in that fight that the style matchup was really what played to Bonavena's strengths, because Frazier's the type of guy who comes right at you, and that's basically the only way it's seen, is you giving Bonavena a chance to win. Mildenberger, who's a much more classically styled boxer in the European sense, and a southpaw on top of that, wasn't seen that he was going to have those same problems, but the right advice, a lot of time spent with somebody who studied him and how to fight him, wound up working out pretty well for him.
Indeed. All right, and now we come to two folks who I don't think we've ever mentioned them before. First, we have Ernie Terrell, who was born April 4th, 1939, and he competed from 57 to 73. He held the WBA heavyweight title from 65 to 67 and was one of the taller heavyweights of his era at 6 foot 6 inches. Terrell was the older brother of the Supremes' early 1970s lead singer Gene Terrell, and in the 60s, Gene sang with Ernie's group Ernie Terrell and the Heavyweights. He had amassed a record of 39-5 going into the fight with our next contender, Thad Spencer, who was born March 28, 1943. He was a native of Portland, Oregon, and he made his debut in boxing in May of 1960. After building up a record of 31-5, he had wins over Doug Jones, Brian London, and Amos Lincoln. And so he was highly regarded enough to be a part of this tournament, though seen as an underdog going into the much more schooled fighter of Ernie Terrell. But it did not go Terrell's way, Pat Mullin, because on that fateful day, May 8th of 1967, Thad Spencer went the distance with the veteran and amassed a unanimous decision victory.
Yeah, Spencer was a real hot prospect coming into this. He was looked at as somebody who potentially could be a lot more than what he wound up being. Just had a really good mix of speed, power, and boxing skill, and was seen as a guy who, if he put it all together, was going to be really just something to behold. And against Terrell, he looked great, because Terrell, we did mention him briefly because Terrell technically is a former heavyweight champion, having been recognized by the WBA when they, kind of stripped Ali for silly reasons during his initial reign. And, of course, Ali beat him very soundly to retake that title. But Terrell's style was very much jab, 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 hold, jab, 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 hold, and Spencer just never let him do it.
Yeah, that Spencer put a beating on Terrell. I was kind of surprised it went the entire, all 12 rounds, but it did. And he got a clear unanimous decision victory. Now, our last pairing features former chapter topic in this series, Floyd Patterson, also former unified heavyweight champion of the world. Again, Floyd Patterson. He took on my favorite fighter of this whole tournament, Old Velvet Pants, Irish, the Bellflower Bomber, Jerry Quarry. He was born 1945, and during the peak of his career, from 68 to 71, Quarry was rated by Ring Magazine as the most popular fighter in the sport, and it had to have been because of his velvet pants. His most famous bouts were against world champions, the aforementioned Floyd Patterson, the aforementioned Jimmy Ellis, Smokin' Joe, Muhammad Ali, and Ken Norton. Quarry had over 200 fights in his amateur career. He turned professional in 65 and finished with a record of 53-9-4, with wins over some of the best heavyweights of his era. Quarry was undersized compared to many of his rivals, but very durable and had a great look. Good old American boy look. A recurring problem was that he would sustain cuts easily, which caused many of his fights to be brought to an end, and he retired in 75, but had comeback fights, as you do, in 77, 83, and 92. And he would win a majority decision over Floyd Patterson on October 28th, 1967.
In a rematch of a fight that had actually occurred earlier that year, that was controversially scored a draw. A lot of people felt that Patterson deserved the nod and maybe didn't get it because he was fighting in California in Quarry's neck of the woods. There were people who felt Quarry deserved it based on an early knockdown he scored of Patterson to make the difference. That being said, these two fought again a couple months later, again in California. But this was kind of a tale of two fights, as it were, because much like in the first fight, Quarry got off to a very good start, decked Patterson a couple times, including another one in the second round, but Quarry never really had to go the full 12-round hard distance to this point, and this was kind of a learning experience for him because he fought a seasoned world champion and really had to work and really had to pull down deep to try to go the distance, and he admittedly was rocked by a lead Patterson right hand later in the fight when it seemed like he ran out of gas. And he built up enough of an early lead, compounded by the knockdowns, but it was a fight where he got some boo birds at the end based on a decision because he finished pretty poor, and that was one that was going to stay in his memory bank based on that.
So that ends the quarterfinal round of the tournament. Our semifinals took place on December 2nd, 1967, and February 3rd, 1968. Jerry Ellis was matched up again with Oscar Bonavena, and Jerry Quarry was matched up with Thad Spencer. And in the former, Ellis won by a unanimous decision. So tell us about how Ellis matched up with Bonavena.
So, what would you think if the odds were that your manager had spent an entire fight camp with your upcoming opponent just one fight before that? Probably pretty good. So Angelo Dundee got to know Oscar Bonavena's habits, his weaknesses, everything about him inside and out, so that by the time it was time for him to fight Jimmy Ellis, there was really nothing Bonavena could hide or do differently. And because of that, they were able to exploit seemingly everything he tried to do, where he looked like his feet were stuck in the mud, he was swinging and missing, he was eating counter shots all night long, and it was a pretty easy fight for Ellis to just walk in and pick up.
I want to take a moment and just talk about some of the builds on these guys. When you think about, like, modern heavyweights, let's just say heavyweights since the 80s, which would be the era that I'm most familiar with till now. I mean, even guys like Tyson Fury or Deontay Wilder, who we started talking about this whole series because of the two of them, mostly Deontay Wilder. These are big, beefy guys. They're not just tall. They're between 6'1", 6'5". I think Tyson Fury is like 6'8". Just a skyscraper of a man. But they are wide. And with the exception of Carl Mildenberger, one of the things I noticed watching all of these fights is how slender these guys are. They're not very wide as near as I can tell. They may be very tall, and they fight tall. That was definitely one of the things I noticed with Jerry Quarry. I'm going to keep calling him Joe. Jerry Quarry, Jimmy Ellis, Bonavina, Thad Spencer, was just how tall and lean they fought and looked. What do you think about that, Pat?
For some of those guys, yeah. Bonavina, to me, a little bit more kind of like almost built like a boxcar. And not in a bad way. He was shorter, a little stockier, but he was muscular. He had, a really kind of broad shoulders, but he was more like a fire hydrant type build.
I mixed up him and Mildenberger. Mildenberger was the taller of the two, and then you had this like short, stocky fire hydrant just wailing on him.
Yeah, but again, you look at the other guys. You're talking Jimmy Ellis, absolutely fits that bill. Ernie Terrell, at 6'6", definitely fit that bill for the build he carried. Mildenberger, the taller guy, lanky. Yeah, a lot of these guys don't really have, the body beautiful the way we grew up seeing guys like Evander Holyfield, probably the most prime example of that.
Even Klitschko. Klitschko didn't light the world on fire, but the man had an impressive body. He had a tiny little waist, and he had a very built-up upper body, and in a good set. He didn't skip leg day. I would not go as far as say he was like professional bodybuilder looking, but he looked like a wrestler bodybuilder, if I remember correctly. Like Klitschko was very lean and muscular, and he looked in better shape than aesthetically. He looked in better shape than some of these guys in this tournament.
For sure, and but again, I'll put the name Deontay Wilder back up there. He's a guy who absolutely looks like Tarzan compared to a lot of these guys, but compared to a lot of these guys, he also fights like Jane.
Well, and that's the other side of it, is while I'm remarking on their builds, I don't know if I've seen a smoother fighter than Jimmy Ellis. For his size and the way he fought, he was like a ballet dancer in there. I don't know if he always gave the most interesting performance, but if you like technical boxing and you like a guy who fights at heavyweight but moves like a welterweight or a middleweight, look no further than Jimmy Ellis.
And again, the reason being because he was a middleweight when he started. And he had a decent career as a middleweight. He fought some very big names like Holly Mims at the time. But, it took a lot out of him. And, at a certain point, he had to make a change. And that's when he really reached out to Angelo Dundee and was like, can you help me? And Dundee thought that he was putting too much effort into making 160 pounds and slowly began a progression to move him up into a heavyweight because he felt with Ellis's boxing skills, his hand speed, that he could make a good go of it. And sure enough, he did.
So let me ask you this last question. It's a two-part question, and I really want to get your opinion on this. Excuse me. When we started this series, we talked about a lot of guys moving up from middleweight to heavyweight because heavyweight was where the money was, but we also started this series in the early 1900s. So it's the 60s. Is there any money at cruiser or light heavyweight?
Well, remember, there is no cruiserweight.
Okay.
That's not a thing that exists at this point in time and won't for another 20 some odd years.
Good answer.
At light heavyweight, at this point in time, there's really not. At this point in time, it's 1967. The light heavyweight championship is now held by Dick Tiger. Yes, you heard that name correctly. And Tiger had just taken it from Customado protege Jose Torres. Tiger had been the middleweight champion and moved up to take that title. He's going to hold it till 69 when he loses to Bob Foster, who begins a reign of terror. And Bob Foster fights a lot of guys who were named guys at the time. But, Mark, you're more a casual fan. Do names like Willie Pastrana, Jose Torres, Dick Tiger, maybe not in that sense, but another, do these names really stick out to you or stand out to you?
No, sir.
Okay, that's part of it, because I say those names, they don't really ring a bell. From the same era, if I tell you heavyweight names like Liston, Frazier, Ali, those names might ring more of a bell, right?
Absolutely. So let's move on to our second semifinal fight. We have Jerry Quarry versus Thad Spencer, which goes to the 12th round, but Jerry Quarry ends up winning by TKO on February 3rd, 1968. And these two...
Maybe the most one-sided fight of the tournament.
Yeah. This was pretty brutal to watch, and I think, if I remember correctly, the referee stopped it in the 12th round. Just, it's such a shame, because this has happened recently in boxing, where people get to the 12th round and you're like, just let them fight. I think this happened on the last Fox card, Fox National Fox card that me and John War covered, where like a fight got stopped with like seconds to go in the last round. Like, that's just brutal.
Yeah, and it's this was more this wasn't necessarily the type of bad stoppage like Chavez and Taylor that ruined one guy's career. But it was kind of a moot point at this point. Why are you going to stop it now? Because Quarry put together one of the better performances you'll ever see, a really complete beatdown of Spencer that started in the first round, when he opened the fight by hurting him with the counter right hand off the bat, and just continued to press the action, make Spencer miss, and just come back with quick counters and hurt him, dropped him several times. And again, credit to Spencer for going through that fight the way he did. But that fight ultimately ruined him. He was never the same after that. I don't think he ever won another fight following that, if I'm not mistaken, and got beaten up by a couple of named guys before eventually he just called it quits like 2 years after.
Yeah, before we end, we'll go over what happened to each one of these guys. 2 months later, we would have our finals of this tournament to crown a new WBA World Heavyweight Champion, Jimmy Ellis versus Jerry Quarry, on April 27th, 1948. And going into it, what was the temperature of the room, so to speak? What did people think was going to happen between Ellis and Quarry? Because Quarry's had a really good showing. Ellis has had a pretty good showing. Ellis had been one of the favorites of the tournament. Quarry's coming up and having a really good showing. I mean, I think when you talk to casual boxing fans and you say, have you ever heard of Jimmy Ellis or Jerry Quarry? And they're like, no, I have no idea who you're talking about. But it feels like, outside of anything involving Joe Frazier, in the late 60s, that was the fight to make.
Yeah, how do I approach this? There's layers to this. And eventually we do get some of these fights that we're talked about, but not all of them. So how do you want to break this down, Mark? Let's go piece by piece.
Okay. You seem like you're struggling. What troubles you, son?
Well, I don't know necessarily how you want to approach it. Do you want to go into like the matchmaking aspect, or do you want to...
Yeah, start there.
Okay, which one do you want to start with?
Start with Jimmy Ellis.
As far as never hearing from anything other than his Joe Frazier fights?
Yes.
Okay. So, with Jimmy, because he's managed by Angelo Dundee, at the same time Angelo is guiding the career of this other guy named Muhammad Ali, there's a lot of times, in the thought process, a conflict of interest, so to speak. because who are you going to put against who? And obviously, when you've got Ali, that's who's your meal ticket. That's who's going to get certain opportunities. When he took Ellis on right after Ali had won the heavyweight title. So he gradually kind of moved him into position while, getting quick wins against nondescript opposition. And in a weird situation, Ellis, we mentioned Tumbler Billy Daniels before. This is probably the only time you'll hear him mentioned multiple times on the podcast. Angelo negotiated a 6-round fight for Jimmy to fight Billy Tumbler Daniels. The idea being he could beat a name heavyweight in a 6-round fight because he could use everything he had at his disposal and walk away with a decision instead of putting himself in danger over a long-term fight by getting caught by a heavyweight, where he could feel his power but still had enough to just fight him off if needed to be because he didn't need to conserve energy for later rounds. And then he goes and scores a couple of quick first-round knockouts over a few guys, including Johnny Pearsall, who had fought as a light heavyweight. And based on that, it was strategic that you move him into that position to be a ranked heavyweight without necessarily beating a ton of ranked heavyweights. But after that situation, he does fight a couple of named guys, but because I think Angelo kind of knew Jimmy's limitations more than we do, obviously, he was always real careful about who to match him with when. And it's really not till after Jimmy is through this tournament that you see him fight more of the name heavyweights of the day.
So let's switch over to Jerry Quarry, who came through this tournament to the degree that it made him a star. People, and I think that's where I was trying to go with this was, you don't have Muhammad Ali. Joe Frazier's fighting for other titles. They're trying to create buzz. They're trying to create a new name, and Jerry Quarry could be that guy. I mean, he had those boyish good looks. He had a nice little gimmick going for him. It's the 60s. He's white. He had all the makings of a possible superstar. But he doesn't get past Ellis. And here's the other thing. Being a fight fan, sometimes, fate brings two guys together and well, this is the best fight we can make at this time. Two evenly matched guys could go either way. There's a lot of buzz, a lot of hype, and the two guys get in there and stink up the joint. And that's kind of what happens with Ellis versus Quarry. Ellis wins by a majority decision, but it's one of those fights that nobody won. People were not happy with the way that fight went down.
Nor should they have been, because it was not a good fight. Ellis was very passive, to use a kind word. Really did not want to engage with Jerry. I talked about how Bonavina's feet were as though he was stuck in the mud. Jerry, probably even more so in this fight, had a really hard time finding Ellis, engaging him, and opening up. It was found out later that Jerry actually went into this fight with a bone break in his back. But he said he didn't feel it played any part in his loss to Ellis, to his credit. He didn't lean on an excuse, even when he had one. He said, maybe it affected my movement a little bit, but I don't think it affected how I feel. I didn't really feel it during the fight. So, again, he took it like a law. He took it like a champ, but everything he showed in the past two fights wasn't there in this fight. And even Ellis, who had really boxed very, very well, had a very different style in this, in which he just refused to engage at any point. This fight took place at the Oakland County Coliseum, and the promoter, who was Don Chargan, who was the California promoter for years and years and years in Northern California and in San Diego, had expected big business and thought this would do a sellout card, and the tickets were $50, $25, $15, and $7. A sellout would have been a gate of 14,000 people. They got 12,000 and change, so it fell short of the expectation on the sales, and it fell short of the expectation on the action.
Yeah, just it's one of those where, not quite some of the Kimbo Slice, Houston Alexander fights we've seen where guys just kind of walking around each other in circles. But still, not what you want to see after they've put all this work and laid all this track to get to a new heavyweight champion. And first of all, you can't tell me. I mean, he can say what he wants to say, but you can't tell me that his back didn't play a role in that, because that is a different fighter in that fight from the first two fights for Jerry Quarry. But let's go through what would happen to these guys post-tournament. So Jimmy Ellis is your new WBA heavyweight champion. And his next fight, which will be in September of 1968 in Stockholm, Sweden. Ikea's from Sweden. I don't know if you guys know this or not, but I like meatballs. And he takes on perennial contender and former champion and member of this tournament, Floyd Patterson. And again, failing to set the world on fire, Jimmy Ellis gets a contested victory in 15 rounds over Floyd Patterson, to the point where the crowd was booing and saying that Patterson really won the fight. Not a good look for Jimmy Ellis.
I have to ask, did you watch this fight?
Patterson Ellis too? No.
Well, Patterson Ellis, but
yeah.
It was so. Patterson actually dropped Ellis. He dropped him twice, but only got it called once. He broke Ellis's nose.
Yes.
And you have to remember that Patterson is immensely popular in Sweden because of his series with Ingemar Johansson and because of what good friends they became afterward. So this is a Patterson crowd from the get-go. The only judge in this fight, because it was contested in Europe, was the referee. And he had a very hard time exiting the building because people were ready to riot, as polite as Sweden is. I've seen this fight maybe 3 times, and every time I see it, I score it the same. I score it 9-5 to 1 for Patterson. So, again, when talking about why we don't necessarily remember Jimmy Ellis as kindly as maybe one thinks you should, it doesn't help when, his title-winning effort is blasé, and his first defense of the title, he should have lost and made Patterson the first ever 3-time heavyweight champion.
Well, it's not going to get any better for Jimmy Ellis in the short term, because he will have a unification title match with Smokin' Joe, who we'll talk about in our next chapter, at the Madison Square Garden on February 16th, 1970, where he will lose the WBA heavyweight title, and Joe Frazier will retain the NYSAC, and he will win the vacant WBC and lineal, that's what I couldn't remember earlier, lineal heavyweight title. So Smokin' Joe Frazier, so let's go through it again. Jimmy Ellis, not a great showing against Jerry Quarry, should have lost to Floyd Patterson, and then got retired in the 4th round of 15 against Smokin' Joe. And that's kind of going to be, he'll go on to have more fights, several more, as a matter of fact, and I'll lay them out for you in just a minute. But this is kind of going to be it for highlights for Mr. Ellis. He will fight Muhammad Ali on July 26, 1971 at the Houston Astrodome for a vacant NABF heavyweight title, and he will lose by TKO in the 12th round.
Of note, though, in that fight, Angelo Dundee was in Ellis's corner because he functioned as both manager and trainer for Ellis, whereas he was only trainer for Ali.
He'll go on a string of KO and TKO victories between Ali and a loss, again, at the Garden to Ernie Shavers.
Oh, what an uppercut.
Yep, knocked out in the first round. He gets a get-well win in Georgia against Al Jones. And, from that point on, it's just one loss or a draw after another. He does have one more shot at good old Smokin' Joe in Melbourne, Australia, and he gets TKO'd in the 9th round. But he caps off his career against Carl Baker in Orlando, Florida, where dreams are made, on May 6th, 1975, where he KOs Carl Baker in the first round. So he goes out a winner. Former heavyweight champion Jimmy Ellis. But what happened to the rest of the fellas in this tournament? We've already talked about Floyd Patterson. You can go back and listen to the chapter on him. Let's talk about Velvet Pants, good old Jerry Quarry. So Jerry Quarry loses to Jimmy Ellis, as we said. He gets several wins in a row, and then he goes up against the buzzsaw, the grinding machine that is the Tank, Joe Frazier, at Madison Square Garden for the vacant NYSAC heavyweight title, where he is retired in the 7th round. And after that, some wins, mostly wins. He'll fight Muhammad Ali on October 26, 1970 in Georgia, where he's retired in the
comeback fight.
Where he's retired in the 3rd round.
Yeah, when you're saying retired, both of those fights were lost on cuts, as you mentioned before, with his propensity to cut.
Mm-hmm. So, after Muhammad Ali beats him the first time, he gets a bunch of get-well wins, looks like 6 in a row, and then he tries his hand at Muhammad Ali again for the NYSAC heavyweight title, and he's TKO'd in the 7th round. He gets a second shot at Joe Frazier a couple of years later, in June 17th of 1974, where, say it with me now, Madison Square Garden. And he gets TKO'd in the 5th round. Gets a handful of fights after that, and finally calls it quits, where all dreams go to die, at the Holiday Inn. He loses a unanimous decision in a 6-round fight against Ron Cranmer at the Holiday Inn Trade Center in Aurora, Colorado. So, let's talk about some of our other friends here in this tournament. We've got... Let's see here. Who do you want to do next, Pat? You want to talk about our European friends?
Yeah, we can go European on this.
Let's see.
So, do you want to start with good old Carl Mildenberger?
Yes, I do.
So, Carl, after his loss to Oscar Bonavena in this one, kind of at this point didn't see a whole lot for himself after going on. He goes back to Europe to defend the EBU heavyweight title, wins against another German fella, I forget his name offhand. He takes one more money offer to fight in the United States, or from someone from the United States, but doesn't want to leave, so they end up fighting in Germany. And it's our friend Leotis Martin, who actually knocks Mildenberger out in the 7th round. And Mildenberger will take one more fight where he'll get disqualified against Henry Cooper, who we spoke about a little bit against Muhammad Ali, for the heavyweight championship of Europe. And he basically gets disqualified for holding because he had been rocked several times by Cooper's trademark left hook and just kept on clinching. And eventually the referee disqualified him. And at that point, Mildenberger gave the statement, something along the lines of, if I had won, I would have gave it up. If I lost, I would have gave it up. And I'm getting out with my health. And the only other thing of note he kind of does in combat after this is in, I want to say it was like 1980 or 1981. He has a worked shoot match with Antonio Inoki, who is trying to paint the picture that he is a real fighter. And so he takes on people from odd disciplines in worked matches, one of them being Carl Mildenberger, based on the fact that Mildenberger was known for fighting Ali.
So, after losing to Jimmy Ellis in Freedom Hall, Kentucky, Louisville, Kentucky, our man, Benavina,
here's an interesting one.
went on to win several fights in a row in Argentina, including a win over Leotis Martin. And then he fights, if you're playing the game Who Didn't Lose to Joe Frazier, he fights Joe Frazier December 10th, 1968, and loses by unanimous decision at the Spectrum in Philadelphia for the NYSAC heavyweight title.
Yeah, he rematches Joe. Loses this time a little more clear decision to him. He's not able to drop Joe. Joe basically grinds on him, beats him up, and they go the 15-round distance. He fights a lot in his native Argentina, where he draws huge crowds at Luna Park. He'll end up being the second comeback fight for Ali after Jerry Quarry, in a fight where he was really giving Ali a lot of problems through the course of the fight, and kind of loses controversially. A lot of people don't bring this up, but in the 15th round, Ali dropped Bonavena and never retreats to a neutral corner. He just stands over Bonavena. The referee does not enforce it, and so he's able to jump on him and drop him a couple more times to get the 3 knockdown rule called in the 15th. But if you watch that fight, it's actually a very highly controversial finish that doesn't get brought up because Ali is Ali when it should. After that, he kind of loses his way in terms of motivation to really keep going. He beats Alvin Blue Lewis, who is a rated contender, but loses to Floyd Patterson. He kind of goes on a win streak against nondescript opposition, and really the only time he steps it up, he loses to Ron Lyle. Where things get interesting for Bonavena is how he died. Bonavena was known as like a guy who really loved nightlife and was always seen with models and actresses and very famous escorts. And Bonavena is living in Vegas at the time, and the way he died was that he was shot by a security guard at the Mustang Ranch, which is a very famous brothel in Reno or just outside of Reno, because he had been messing around with the owner's girlfriend. And supposedly some kind of conflict happened, and there was a justifiable homicide that involved the killing of Oscar Bonavena.
Oh, my goodness. Wow, what a story. That brings us to Leotis Martin, who in 2003 was named on the Ring's list of 100 greatest punches of all time. However, as the wiki tells me, his career was marked by inconsistency and bad luck.
It's a sad ending for Leotis.
So, yeah, he doesn't have much of a career after 67. He goes about 2 years.
There's reasons.
Okay.
So, Leotis, he loses to Jimmy here in this tournament and kind of goes 500 in his next couple. He'll beat Thad Spencer. He'll lose to Bonavena. He'll beat Mildenberger, but lose to Henry Clark, which was a bit of an upset. He fights Blue Lewis. But he gets his biggest career break in 1969 when he fights a comebacking Sonny Liston.
Yes. What a crazy story this is. So, he KOs Sonny Liston at the International Hotel and Casino in Las Vegas in the 9th round on June 12, 1969.
Brutal knockout.
And the notes say, so he wins the NABF heavyweight title. Martin had been knocked down in round 4 and was behind on points when he KO'd Liston with a vicious right. Martin was then forced to retire shortly afterwards as he suffered a detached retina. This guy can't win for losing.
Yeah, he just gets the biggest break of his career with the most significant victory, and in stunning, impressive fashion in a great fight. And he detaches his retina, and it really sucks because knowing what could have come of that could have led to a fight with Joe Frazier in Philadelphia, where they're both from. That would have been huge. Could have led to a fight with Ali, where no matter what, you're getting a big payday. Just really disappointing that happened for Martin, who retired and worked locally in Philadelphia as a machinist, and just kind of lived life for years on, and never got to claim that upper tier heavyweight glory that eluded him, and passed away at a pretty young age. Actually, he was only 56 years old, and pretty much died right after he had retired working. So kind of a sad, unfulfilling end for Leotis Martin.
Yeah, interestingly enough, post Jimmy Ellis, he actually had wins. He had a KO over Mildenberger on May 4th, 1968 in Germany, and a TKO in the round 9 over Thad Spencer. However, his luck would not hold out against Bonavita on July 9th, 1968. Another thing of note about this poor bastard, he apparently KO'd Sonny Banks on October 5th, 1965, and poor Sonny Banks died of injuries sustained in that fight.
Yeah, Sonny Banks also the first guy to ever knock down Muhammad Ali.
Huh. So, let's talk about Thad Spencer, and I think that's the last guy on our list without going back over Floyd Patterson.
And Ernie Terrell.
We talked about Ernie, didn't we?
Oh, no, we didn't.
Oh, shit. Okay. So we'll do Thad Spencer, and then we'll close out with Ernie Terrell.
Yeah.
All
so,
right. Go ahead.
So, yeah, we talked about the beating Thad took at the hands of Jerry Quarry. And there's certain times in a fighter's career where they take that beating and they're never the same again. That was the case for Thad Spencer, who I'm looking at it to make sure, but yeah, he never won another fight after that. He gets matched up tough in his next three. He fights Leotis Martin and gets knocked out. He fights Billy Walker, who is a pretty decent English heavyweight, and gets knocked out. And then he fights a real hot prospect who wound up going 26-0 with 26 KOs, named MacArthur Mac Foster, who blows through him in one round before Mac's undefeated streak ends at the hands of Velvet Pants himself, Jerry Quarry. He gets a draw with Charlie Reno, loses to Tony Doyle, gets knocked out by Jose Luis Garcia, who's really his note in history is that he's the first guy to ever beat Ken Norton. Loses to Ron Stander, who we'll talk about on the Joe Frazier episode for some fun, and an unknown named Tony Doyle to finish his career and round out at 32-13-1. Kind of sad considering when he went into this tournament and was looked at as a guy who potentially could be a favorite. It's 32-5. And to finish, just losing 8 of your last 9, and the one you don't lose is a draw, that's disappointing, especially for a guy who had such potential. He ended up, one of his sons played football for USC in the 80s and wound up being in the NFL. But that's kind of Thad's note, is that he's another guy with a guy who was seen. I think it's just one of those things where he met the wrong guy at the wrong time, and it just shattered his confidence.
It happens. So, again, one of the early favorites of this tournament, Ernie Terrell, who actually won the vacant WBA heavyweight title on March 5th, 1965, in Chicago against Animation, Mushin, however you pronounce it. He had Machin. Okay. He retained against Chuvalo and Doug Jones in short order, November 1st of 65 and June 28th of 66. And then he lost to Muhammad Ali on February 6th, 1967 at the Astrodome. Of course, and then he takes on Thad Spencer, and he's supposed to walk through him, and it doesn't happen. He gets beaten by decision. And then in a get-well fight in Mexico in 1967, October 14th, he loses again, this time a unanimous decision, in 10 rounds to Manuel Ramos. He gets his shit together shortly after that. He wins several in a row, including Sonny Moore, John Hudgens, Vic Brown, Luis Faustino Pires, Roberto Davila, Jose Luis Garcia, and finally Bill Drover. And then, and that's why I led up to this, he takes on Rocky influence Chuck Wepner. Yes, he fights the mighty Chuck for the vacant National America's Heavyweight title in Atlantic City, New Jersey on June 23rd, 1973. And he loses. He lost to Chuck Wepner, the guy everybody was knocking out at one time or another. Chuck Wepner beats him, and then he closes out his career in Madison Square Garden, getting TKO'd in the first round of September 1973 against Jeff Merritt.
Candy Slim, one of the great never was prospects as well, Jeff Merritt.
Are we going to spend some time talking about Chuck Wepner at any time, or do you just want to get this out of the way now? Okay.
God, no. We're talking... No.
Not a forgotten son? Not somebody you want to spend some time talking about? You want to maybe...
If we do a contenders series of this, he still won't be on that.
What about guys who influenced movies? Guys that were in movies.
Well, guys who were almost in movies.
We could do him. We could do the Hurricane.
We can do a watch along of his fight with Andre the Giant. How about that?
Oh, poor Chucky. All right.
That's a real thing.
I know. All right. I think that wraps it up. So that's the WBA tournament. Next time, we will finally get to one of my personal favorites, not named Mike Tyson. Good old Smokin' Joe Frazier. Give him a little taste, Pat.
Yeah, Joe Frazier, straight out of the 1964 Olympics, winning the heavyweight gold medal. Joe is the first guy to win the heavyweight gold medal and then a heavyweight championship as a professional, believe it or not. Ali's gold was at light heavyweight. Patterson did not win gold, and he competed as a middleweight. So this is going to be a taste of one of the real unsung heroes of the heavyweight division, a guy whose reign lasts a lot longer than people assume it does, and makes a lot of defenses in a short period of time, and is a guy who is really if you ever want to know why Philadelphia sucks, Philadelphia has a statue of a fictional heavyweight champion, when in reality they have one of the very best ever who inspired a ton of people, and they don't have a statue of him.
Yeah, that's embarrassing and unfortunate. So next time, here on our trip through the wild and woolly history of the heavyweight championship of the world, boxing heavyweight championship, we will talk about Smokin' Joe Frazier, and we'll pick a date. You'll find out about it on an upcoming podcast. In the meantime,
we might even include audio of him singing either Mustang Sally or My Way.
Oh gosh, if I vote for My Way. Tomorrow night, if you've now that we've handled the serious business, we can talk about the silly. Myself and the Podsman will review Money in the Bank 2020 from the WWE. And if that doesn't whet your appetite, myself, in theory, assuming it actually happens, myself and Sean Comer will review the first season of the TV series on Hulu, exclusive TV series, High Fidelity, this Wednesday. And then, at Sean's request, so I assume it will happen, we will be doing an on-trial for the John Cusack movie, High Fidelity. Next week...
Can I say something?
You certainly.
Guilty.
Next week, speaking of guilty, we will be closing out our run of reviews on the new animated She-Ra and the Princess of Power series. We'll be reviewing Season 5, myself and Alexis Haina. And then the gang will be back, the Damn You Hollywood gang, will be back to review Scoob. And then Pat Mullin, the punchy pugilist, oh boy, we're back and we're talking wrestling. We are going to look at Season 2, From Benoit to the Road Warriors, Dark Side of the Ring. Are you excited, Pat?
Actually, very much so.
Yeah, I've enjoyed this season a lot. Learned some things I didn't know before, so it'll be fun to talk about. Larry Zonka, he likes to do them one by one. I like to do them all at once. That's how I like them. All right, so last week we only had 2 shows. Alexis Haina and I did a comic strip for I Am Not Okay With This, and myself and Robert Winfrey buried, as it should have been, Castlevania Season 3. Pat, other than what I have put out there, both past and future, what do you got going on?
So I actually did a quick guest spot on the 411 Ground and Pound Mania show this past weekend, kind of doing a preview show with Robert Winfrey for this upcoming UFC 249 event that just happened. So if you want to hear my brilliance of picking Justin Gaethje to win before the fight happened, you can go ahead and listen to that, because I did that.
People should acknowledge my brilliance for picking Henry Cejudo over old broken knees Dominic Cruz.
Should they, though?
True genius never gets appreciated in its time. Years from now, people will know that I am a soothsayer in the world of combat sports. I know all the things.
Yeah.
All right, you got anything else going on, Pat?
Just want to remind you all that Mark picked James Toney to beat Randy Couture.
I'm never going to live that down. All right, folks. That's enough out of you, Pat. Thank you for joining us on this next chapter. Chapter 8, Smokin' Joe, coming soon. Until then, for Pat Mullin, be well, be safe, and behave.